Gold versus Bitcoin. That is the debate that has divided the traders across the world.
Bitcoin is something that doesn't exist. Gold is demanded for jewelry because it's fashionable. The actual value of the Bitcoin or the gold from day to day, from week to week to month, is all about sentiment. It's all about demand. The price of Bitcoin has been rising. Bitcoin is nothing but a computer program. In one very important sense, they're quite different, which is that gold exists. You can pick it up, you can hold it in your hand, you can lick it if you want. You can't rely on any one particular asset or one particular instrument. That's just religion.
Are you guys team Bitcoin or team gold? Glen Goodman was made famous when he turned about £3,000 into about 100,000 when he was trading stocks during the Great Financial Crisis in 2008. But after that, transitioned into cryptocurrencies, and today he has some 250,000 Facebook followers that follow his every move to know better if they should be buying or selling their crypto holdings. So let's get going, and we'll start directly with the first question. Hello Glenn, how you doing? And thanks so much for joining us today.
Hi, it's good to be here. How you doing, Alex?
I'm doing good, actually, given that it's lockdown when we're doing this and we're recording this from home. But let's take it from the beginning. Can you give us just a basic introduction to what Bitcoin is for people that don't know?
Bitcoin is nothing but a computer program, in essence. It was invented by a mysterious guy, Satoshi Nakamoto. Nobody knows who Satoshi Nakamoto really is, or if that's their real name. Probably isn't their real name. And the idea was to try and solve problems around the store of value that really go back to the very beginning of the invention of money. There are certain problems that still hadn't really been solved, and we see that today, of course, with the wild gyrations in currencies internationally, particularly the dollar, which everybody relies on as the world's reserve currency, and yet the Federal Reserve is effectively printing ridiculous amounts of it. So, the dollar can be created in pretty much infinite amounts if it suits the United States to do so. And that's not just a problem in terms of the dilution of the value of the dollar for people who live in America. It's a problem for the entire world. Now, Satoshi Nakamoto was trying to sort of get around that, amongst other problems, by inventing a new type of currency that only exists in a digital form and, crucially, cannot be printed in infinite amounts. The original coding for Bitcoin makes it very clear that there must be a maximum of 21 million Bitcoins in existence. At the moment, we've got about 18.5 million that have been mined. We talk about mining. Mining is basically just the process of conducting complex computer operations on very powerful computers that slowly bring more and more Bitcoin into existence. We've now got 18.5 million Bitcoins out of the total 21 million, and the remainder will be created over the next 100 years or so. So really, we've got a big sort of chunk of Bitcoin that now exists, and only a tiny little new supply coming out bit by bit.
All right, Glenn, thank you so much for that answer. Now, of course, most people know what gold is, but we're going to include this here anyway. What is gold?
Gold is, according to many people, the ultimate source of money. Gold was used as money, obviously, for much of human history in various places and in various kind of different forms. Sometimes it was sort of diluted with other metals, sometimes it was used in its pure form, and sometimes it was used in a representative form. In other words, there would be a certain amount of gold stored by the government or some kind of central bank, and then there would be notes issued, banknotes that were backed up by gold. What happened in 1971, crucially, is that Richard Nixon, the President of the United States, decided to break the link between gold and the dollar. Previously, there had been a promise that any dollar could be cashed in for gold at any time. It was more sort of a symbol, more symbolic than anything else. People weren't continually going to the Federal Reserve and trying to cash in their dollars for gold, but the point was it sort of created trust. And then once he broke that link and said we're no longer going to just exchange it for gold, the dollar became the sort of the world's money in itself. But because, as we're now discovering, you can print infinite amounts of it, there is a danger that people will lose respect for the dollar, lose faith in the dollar. That's what worries people who really love gold and see it as kind of the ultimate money.
The fact that the Federal Reserve has a 2% inflation target means that the dollar does loosen about 2% of its value per year, which results in inflation. And that is, of course, one of the reasons why people like gold, and as well why people like Bitcoin, as you mentioned earlier there. So that's, I guess, maybe the first similarity that people say, and that is that I want to invest in gold and I want to invest in Bitcoin because you can't print that unlimitedly. And that's a really nice feature with both of them.
I guess the main similarity is the lack of ability to print it in in infinite quantities. That's the kind of the thing that unites the two, because really, in one very important sense, they're quite different, which is that gold exists. You can pick it up, you can hold it in your hand, you can lick it if you want, whereas Bitcoin, you can't touch it. I guess an important point that I didn't mention specifically earlier on, that young people perhaps can get to grips with easier than older people, is that younger people have grown up with electronic money as a natural thing. I mean, even I grew up with, not being the youngest person in the world, but I grew up with mainly electronic money, paying for things by card and so on. But still, there were a lot of notes and coins around when I was a kid. Notes and coins are still around, but in lesser quantities. Now, if you grew up and you're, say, only 20 years old right now, yeah, you'll have used notes and coins, but you'll have used your cards so much that you kind of see money as an electronic thing anyway, something that's just transferred from account to account to account. And that's effectively what Bitcoin is. It's just a store of value that you transfer from one account to another.
The problem with Bitcoin is going to be in a World War III scenario is like maybe we won't have access to computers, maybe we won't have our phones, we're not going to be able to charge them the way we want to. So how are you going to pay then? And that's where maybe gold becomes more valuable, I would argue. What's your thoughts on that?
People who've been thinking about that whole issue, but Bitcoin enthusiasts, because obviously that's a criticism that comes at them quite often. That if there was World War III, what are you going to do? Because Bitcoin's an online thing. Now, the way that Bitcoin is structured, it's structured as a network of computers. That's all it is. It needs computers networked to each other in order to exist, in order to sort of survive and thrive. Some of those computers do mining. Some of them are just users' computers. Some of them sort of perform other useful functions like verifying transactions, which is all tied up with mining as well. Sort of verifying that the transactions are real and true when one person transfers Bitcoin from one place to another. But in the event of the internet just ceasing to exist, in theory, as long as you've still got electricity, then you can still network computers together and, some form of digital currency could still exist in some way. In fact, actually, the Chinese, who, as I say, are putting together their own purely digital version of the yuan, their plan is that you'll be able to make offline transactions, that you'd actually be able to transfer money from one person to another without being connected to the internet. Their digital currency is obviously, like all digital currencies, is based on the blueprint that Bitcoin came up with, but has many, many differences to make it sort of centralized. One of the beauties of Bitcoin, which I haven't mentioned, is that it's decentralized. There's no person in control of it, whereas the national digital currencies like the one China's inventing are centralized. They will be controlled by governments. It's controlled by the Chinese government. It's currently in trials at the moment. But as I say, there is the capability there for offline transactions. So in World War III, I mean, you've got to say, in World War III, gold, are people still going to want to hold a shiny yellow metal when really the only things people will care about are food and shelter? I think gold is a little bit over-egged as something that could survive any disaster scenario as a store of value, personally.
When people talk about gold and Bitcoin, you talk about intrinsic value. What's your thoughts on that?
I would say no. Which is a controversial thing to say, because most people who value Bitcoin or gold or both of them think that there is some kind of fundamental value to its existence. I don't agree. I think both are purely based on demand and not supply. There is the fact that neither of them can be created in unlimited quantities, so that kind of puts a cap on supply. But the actual value of the Bitcoin or the gold from day to day, from week to week, to month, is all about sentiment, and it's all about demand.
So how does the adaptation of Bitcoin going? Are there like any countries that are using it, or any firms that are using it?
Governments haven't latched onto Bitcoin. A lot of businesses, a lot of apps are based on Ethereum, which is kind of the second most popular cryptocurrency. But Bitcoin itself is now seen mainly as a digital gold. It's seen as a store of value for the future. And, whilst I've been perhaps a little bit scathing about it at times during this interview, the fact is that during the period that we're recording this interview, where the US Federal Reserve is printing unlimited amounts of money, the price of Bitcoin has been rising. Whether or not it continues to rise, of course, is based on sentiment. It's based on whether people continue to believe in the idea that Bitcoin has value, just like they believe in the idea that gold has value.
I think the number one reason why governments don't like Bitcoin is they're going to lose control, as you say. And when you lose control, you can't tax people the way you want. The other thing that's quite interesting as well, and one of the reasons we moved away from the gold standard is that in times of deflation, in the case of gold, gold needs to be able, the availability of gold needs to be able to expand as the economy grows bigger. And I think there's some similar issues that can be with Bitcoin at one point when all the coins have been mined, where you need to have that flexibility. So what do you think are the biggest challenges in general?
Number one challenge is national governments and regulators, because they could actually kill Bitcoin altogether if they fancy, particularly the American government and the American regulators. Well, when I say kill it altogether, it would still continue to exist in a decentralized fashion, because it is decentralized. Nobody can turn the off switch. You'd still have computers networked together. But what they can do, the power that national governments have, is to ban the fiat on-ramps. The way that you turn your normal currency, your fiat currency, your whatever you have, pounds, dollars, euros, the way that you turn it into Bitcoin, you need to go through traditional channels to some degree in order to do that, because of course your money is in a bank account and you need to turn it into a digital form, and you need companies and middlemen and that kind of thing in order to make that happen. Now, what we've seen in the past, that when governments have taken steps to effectively ban Bitcoin, they're quite successful at it, because all they do is say to all their banks, you're not allowed to deal with companies, with cryptocurrency companies. And the second biggest, as I say, are other cryptocurrencies, because frankly, Bitcoin was the oldest, it was the original, but it's not the best. Lots of technologies have come along since, lots of cryptocurrencies that, in my opinion, are much more effective. They scale better. One of the problems with Bitcoin, which has only been sort of semi-solved, is that once there are a lot of people making transactions, then it can get very, very slow and very, very expensive to use.
So what do you think about market volatility? Because I think that is interesting. It's like a double-edged sword. The fact that Bitcoin moves the way it does attracts speculators. They want to go in and use it. On the other hand, like from a business point of view, like if you want to price your products and services and Bitcoin, it feels a bit difficult because you can't just receive Bitcoin and have it on your account. And I see that actually like a big limitation to using this. What are your thoughts on that?
To some extent, I feel the same way about gold. And, that's obviously a very controversial thing to say for anybody who loves gold and thinks that it's the true, real form of money and that everything should be priced in gold. But the fact is, the price of gold has had massive gyrations over the years. It had an enormous spike in 1980 where it reached, an all-time high. And then, after that, the price declined slowly for the next 20 years. And it got so cheap that people had effectively given up on it, or most people had given up on it as any kind of money, as any kind of store of value, because it had lost so much of its value against other currencies, fiat currencies, over that 20-year period. And then it started rising again, and it rose by an enormous amount. It's sort of more than 10 times. Bitcoin has exactly the same problem, of course. These enormous gyrations in value mean that you can't just put all your money into Bitcoin and just rely on it, because that would be insanity.
You know, people say that Bitcoin acts like a safe haven, and I have seen it in some situations in certain countries where they have huge amount of inflation, where I think the local population had easier to buy Bitcoin than to shift out into other currencies. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there are some countries. I mean, initially Venezuela became a big Bitcoin country for a while because of the inflation that they were suffering and all the other economic problems that they've been having in recent years that of course have caused millions of people to emigrate from Venezuela to other nearby countries. Bitcoin was a way for some people to maintain some kind of value, they felt, because even though its price was gyrating, it still was a way, at least, to get away from their native fiat currency that was just inflating so fast that all their savings were just worth nothing very, very quickly. And you know, they would ideally all have just had dollars, because the dollar was much more stable, but it was harder to get hold of dollars. You know, if you're in a country that's in that much chaos, it can be hard to get hold of actual dollars.
Yeah. And what are your thoughts on the correlation between Bitcoin and stock markets?
Generally speaking, Bitcoin has not been correlated with stock markets for most of its history. But then what happened in March 2020, when everybody got terrified about coronavirus and the lockdowns started happening, stocks tanked, and basically everybody panicked, and everything tanked along with them. And that often happens in panics. It happened in 2008. People forget that things that weren't at all correlated, you know, various metals and various agricultural products and stocks and everything starts falling at the same time because everybody gets really scared. And they just sell everything that they can get their hands on. But as you say, you know, the idea is that Bitcoin's supposed to be a safe haven in times of trouble. And clearly that wasn't the case. But it wasn't the case for gold either, you know, initially. Though, of course, gold and Bitcoin have both sort of come into their own in the months following the crash, but as have stocks. They've kind of moved. They went down with stocks, and they went up with stocks as well. So, and in fact, even at the point that we're recording this interview, I would say that the correlation is still not completely broken.
And what do you think is the outlook now? If you had to make a choice, you had to buy Bitcoin or you had to buy gold?
Maybe Bitcoin, because the potential is greater. You know, people talk about Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a much smaller market at the moment. So the potential for it to grow much larger and for the price of Bitcoin to grow by many, many multiples is probably greater than the potential for gold to grow by many, many multiples. So for that reason, if I had to choose, I'd choose Bitcoin.
All right, Glenn, thank you so much for clearing this up.
Thanks very much, Alex.
To everybody now that's there at home, are you guys team Bitcoin or team gold? Let us know in the comments below. As well, to stay up to date for the latest market news, make sure you hit the subscribe button we have here on YouTube, and there's a little bell button there as well you can click on. That way you get notifications when we produce videos like this, but also produce market updates.